The year was 1849, and whispers of gold echoed across the nation like a fever. Families left behind farms, small shops, and the safety of their towns to chase a dream that glittered brighter than reason. California became a word heavy with promise, a frontier where fortunes could be pulled from rivers with bare hands or vanish into dust before the sun set. Among the countless wagons creaking westward, the Dawson family carried not only tools and provisions, but the fragile hope of rewriting their destiny. James Dawson believed the West was more than gold. It was freedom from the cycle of debt and struggle that chained his family in Missouri. His wife, Margaret, saw the risk more clearly than he did. Sickness on the trails, bandits in the shadows, and the cruel indifference of the wilderness. Yet she walked beside him, guided by loyalty and the quiet belief that survival, if earned, could one day be turned into stability. Their two children, too young to understand the weight of the journey, clutched small keepsakes from home, reminders of a life they might never return to. This is not just a story of picks and pans striking the earth. It is the saga of ordinary people who learned that true fortune lay not in glittering dust, but in choices, resilience, and the will to build something lasting. Stay with me until the end, because the Dawsons' journey holds lessons about vision, hardship, and the roots of legacy. And before we begin, let me ask you, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to leave a like. It helps us keep these stories alive. The first morning on the trail was colder than James Dawson expected. Frost clung to the canvas of the wagon, and the oxen's breath rose like steam as they strained against the weight of everything the family owned. James tightened the ropes one last time, glancing back at the farmhouse shrinking in the distance. It was no palace, but it had been home. Now, all he carried was faith that California would give them more than Missouri ever could. Margaret walked beside the wagon, her skirts brushing against frozen grass. She held her youngest child close, whispering songs meant more to calm herself than the baby. Each step felt heavier than the last. The trail stretched endlessly, a road of uncertainty. She wondered if they had been reckless, leaving behind familiarity for whispers of fortune. Yet when she looked at James, she saw the determination in his eyes and chose to match it with her own quiet resolve. Days on the prairie blurred into one another. The sound of wagon wheels groaning, children crying, and the constant creak of leather straps became the rhythm of their lives. The children grew used to walking beside the wagon until their shoes wore thin, their laughter replaced by silence. Margaret sewed patches by firelight, her fingers raw, but she never complained aloud. Hardship was constant. Storms swept across the plains with brutal force, flattening tents and drenching clothes until every layer was soaked. Rivers turned into obstacles that swallowed wagons whole. James often waded waist-deep in icy water, guiding the oxen across while Margaret prayed from the shore, clutching her children as if her grip alone could keep the family whole. Yet even in struggle, there was wonder. The Dawsons saw mountains rising like ancient sentinels, rivers that shimmered under moonlight, and skies so wide they seemed to swallow the world. For the children, it was as if they had stepped into a storybook, even as their parents knew the cost of reaching this far. Beauty and hardship wove themselves together, teaching the family that hope often lives beside despair. Around campfires, strangers became companions. Stories were traded for warmth. Some spoke of fortunes won, others of families buried along the trail. James listened closely, weighing each tale like a lesson. One evening, a miner who had already failed once in California shared his bitter truth. "The gold's not in the rivers," he said, his voice cracked from whiskey and dust. "The real fortune's in what the miners can't live without." The words lodged in James's mind like a seed, though he didn't yet know what it might grow into. Margaret heard the same words and felt a flicker of clarity. She didn't speak of it then, but she began to see their journey in a new light. Perhaps survival wasn't about pulling treasure from the earth. Perhaps it was about finding strength in service, in building something that others depended on. That night, she looked at James differently, as if silently asking him to consider the same possibility. Illness traveled as swiftly as the wagons. Fever swept through the camp, stealing lives in the dark. Margaret nursed her children with damp cloths and whispered prayers, her body trembling from exhaustion, but her spirit unbroken. James dug shallow graves for others, his heart heavy with the reminder of how fragile hope could be. They had risked everything, and now the gamble seemed crueler than he had imagined. When doubt clawed at him, James lifted his eyes to the stars. They hung steady and eternal above the endless plains, indifferent to the suffering below. He wondered if anyone would remember families like theirs, families who didn't chase glory but endured quietly, building something stronger than the fleeting shine of gold. He didn't have the answer, but he carried the question like a torch to keep moving forward. By the time they reached the edge of California, the Dawsons were no longer the same family that had left Missouri. The trail had stripped away comfort, illusion, and fear, leaving only resilience and determination. The road west had tested them, but it had also forged them, and though they had yet to touch a single ounce of gold, James and Margaret knew one truth: their real fortune might be waiting in choices, not in rivers. When the Dawsons finally reached California, the sight that greeted them was nothing like the dream James had imagined. Tents stretched along the riverbanks in every direction, their canvas walls blackened with smoke from campfires. The air was thick with shouts of discovery, the clang of picks against stone, and the restless hum of men who believed the next pan of dirt would change their lives. The gold rush wasn't just a movement, it was a frenzy. James joined the crowds with a shovel in his hands, blistered palms gripping it like a lifeline. He worked dawn to dusk, his body bent over rivers that promised little and delivered even less. Each strike of the pick echoed his desperation, each pan of muddy water, another reminder that luck favored the few and mocked the many. Margaret waited with the children at camp, boiling beans and stretching flour into bread that barely lasted the week. She watched James return each evening, his shoulders drooping lower, his silence heavier. The gold they had chased across half a continent slipped through their fingers like sand, and Margaret's fear grew sharper with each passing day. They were not alone. Families who had traveled the same road west now faced the same cruel truth. For every tale of sudden fortune, there were 100 men who returned to camp with empty hands. The dream that had set the world on fire was built on a foundation of broken backs and broken spirits. One evening, as James slumped by the fire, he remembered the words of the miner they had met months earlier. The real fortune isn't in the earth. It's in what the miners can't live without. He looked around the camp and saw the hunger in men's eyes, the worn-out boots, the tools in need of repair. Everywhere he turned, there was need that could be met if someone had the courage to see it differently. Margaret was the first to act. She baked extra bread, selling it to miners who would pay almost anything for food that reminded them of home. The loaves disappeared within minutes, traded for coins that carried more certainty than any ounce of gold dust. For the first time since arriving, Margaret felt control slipping back into her hands. James followed her lead. Instead of swinging his pick, he began repairing tools, mending handles, sharpening blades. At first, the miners scoffed, but when their shovels snapped or their pans cracked, they came to James, grateful for a man who could keep their dreams alive just one more day. Soon, word spread that the Dawsons offered more than survival. They offered stability. The transformation was subtle but profound. While others chased fortune in the rivers, the Dawsons built fortune beside them. Their camp grew busier each day, and the coins Margaret stacked carefully at night began to outweigh the disappointment James once carried home. The children laughed again, their bellies full, their eyes brighter. The Dawsons had found a rhythm the mines could never provide. Still, temptation lingered. Each time James saw a man stumble into camp shouting of a new strike, a part of him longed to chase after it. But Margaret's steady hands, flour-dusted and firm, reminded him of what they were building. This was no longer about luck. It was about vision, the courage to step away from the crowd and claim a different path. And so the Dawsons began their quiet revolution. They had not come west to serve bread and mend tools, yet that choice, born of necessity, marked the true beginning of their fortune. California was a furnace that consumed the unprepared, but for the Dawsons, it became the ground where roots of wealth began to take hold. What began as a single loaf of bread and a few repaired tools soon grew into something larger. The Dawsons built a small stand at the edge of the mining camp, a wooden table shaded by a patch of canvas, offering bread, dried meat, and simple repairs. It looked modest, almost laughable, beside the restless fury of the goldfields, yet it drew men in like moths to light. At first, it was the food. Miners lined up for Margaret's bread, paying in coins, gold dust, or even favors. The smell of fresh loaves carried across the camp, reminding weary men of homes they might never see again. Margaret's quiet smile, steady and unpretentious, made every bite feel like more than sustenance. It was comfort. James, meanwhile, had become the camp's indispensable repairman. A broken pick could end a miner's chance, but James gave those tools another life. He charged fair prices, never exploiting desperation, and soon men spoke his name with respect. Trust, in a place where greed poisoned everything, became his strongest currency. The children helped in small ways, gathering firewood, carrying water, measuring flour. They learned quickly that every hand mattered. In their young eyes, the stand wasn't just work. It was proof that their family had found a place in this wild, uncertain land. Within months, the stand grew into a tent, and the tent into a rough wooden structure with shelves lined by goods. Margaret stocked it with flour, coffee, salt, and blankets. James bartered for wagon parts, nails, and lanterns. What had started as survival began to resemble a true store. Other families noticed. Some ridiculed the Dawsons for abandoning the real hunt for gold. Others envied the steady flow of customers. But when those same skeptics needed bread, or when their wagon wheel cracked, they came quietly to the Dawsons' door. Success spoke louder than pride. One evening, as James counted coins by the firelight, Margaret leaned close and whispered, "We came chasing gold, but maybe this is what we were meant to build." James looked at their children, sleeping soundly for the first time in months, and realized she was right. Their fortune wasn't glittering in pans at the river. It was growing steadily in their hands. By the following year, James used their savings to buy a small plot of land near the trading post. It was barren soil at first, but to James it represented permanence. He hammered stakes into the ground, each strike echoing his conviction that they were planting roots deeper than any mine could offer. The store stood taller with each season. Its shelves filled, its walls strengthened, and its doorway welcomed not only miners, but families, travelers, and locals alike. People came not only to buy, but to gather, to exchange news, and to feel for a moment that they belonged to something stable. The Dawsons had transformed. No longer wanderers or dreamers, they were builders. They had discovered that the true wealth of California wasn't buried in rivers, but in vision, labor, and the trust of a community. What began as bread and tools had become their first real enterprise, the seed of a legacy that would outlast the gold rush itself. Success, as the Dawsons quickly learned, carried its own burdens. The more their store grew, the more attention it attracted, some of it welcome, much of it not. James often stayed up late by candlelight, scratching numbers into his ledger with tired hands. Profit was steady, but so were the risks. Envy was a shadow that followed every step they took. One night, that shadow struck. James awoke to the sound of splintering wood. Their store had been broken into, shelves overturned, supplies scattered, coins stolen. The loss was painful, but the deeper wound came from knowing someone had tried to strip away everything they had worked so hard to build. James sat among the wreckage at dawn, fists tight, jaw clenched, wondering if the dream had been foolish all along. Margaret found him there, surrounded by the silence of failure. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice steady. "We didn't cross mountains and rivers to give up here. This is what they want, for us to break, but we won't." Her words cut through the despair, pulling James back from the edge of surrender. They rebuilt. Stronger doors, reinforced windows, and neighbors who agreed to watch each other's shops. The break-in, rather than destroying them, became a turning point. People respected those who endured storms, and soon their reputation deepened into something unshakable. Out of hardship, they earned not just customers, but loyalty. As the store thrived again, new opportunities appeared. James purchased more land, leasing plots to farmers who longed for stability. He built stables where travelers could rest their horses, charging fair prices that kept business steady. Margaret managed the store with quiet authority, making sure its shelves were never bare. Together, they turned each challenge into an expansion, each obstacle into another root planted firmly in California soil. But prosperity also demanded choices. One investor approached James with a proposition: join a new mining company, well-funded and promising vast returns. It was tempting. The very dream that had carried them west still whispered in his heart. James spent sleepless nights imagining what a single strike could bring. Margaret, however, saw more clearly. She reminded him of the bread, the tools, the orchard beginning to sprout on their land. "We already found our fortune," she told him softly. "Not in dust, but in what we've built together. Don't let greed take us back to uncertainty." Her words settled in him like anchors. He declined the offer, a decision that set them apart. Many who had arrived alongside the Dawsons lost everything chasing new strikes, never satisfied with enough. James and Margaret chose differently. They chose to protect, to grow, and to endure. The family's days became steadier. Their children, now older, helped run the store, learned to tally accounts, and walked the fields with pride. They were not just inheriting land or money, but lessons etched in sacrifice and resilience. Trials had tested the Dawsons, but in each test they found clarity. Their fortune was no longer a dream of glittering rivers. It was the steady rise of walls, the planting of orchards, and the bond of a community that trusted them. Each choice carved the shape of their legacy. Years slipped by, and the roar of the gold rush quieted. The rivers no longer swarmed with hopeful diggers, and the camps that once pulsed with frenzy stood abandoned, their tents collapsing back into the soil. Many who had come west returned home with little more than broken dreams. But the Dawsons remained, their roots sinking deeper with every season. The small plot of land James purchased years earlier had blossomed into something far greater. Orchards stretched across rolling hills, their blossoms painting the spring air with fragrance. Fields, once barren, now yielded harvests that fed not just their family, but the town that had grown around them. What had begun with bread and tools had transformed into something enduring. Margaret stood at the doorway of the store, now sturdier than ever, her shelves stacked with goods that reached beyond necessity. Farmers, travelers, and townsfolk alike passed through her doors, not just for flour or lantern oil, but for connection. The Dawsons had become more than merchants. They were anchors in a community that had outlasted the fever of gold. James, his hair silvered with age, walked the rows of apple trees at dawn, his hands brushing the branches as though they were his legacy made flesh. Each tree was proof of a choice once made in desperation that had turned into stability. He no longer dreamed of striking gold. His wealth lay in orchards, in land, in the certainty that his children would inherit more than hardship. Their children had grown too. One son spoke of expanding the store into the city, while another dreamed of tending the orchards and building a vineyard. Margaret watched them with pride, knowing the values they carried were worth more than any nugget mined from the earth. They had inherited not just property, but perspective. Travelers who passed through often asked if the Dawsons had struck it rich. The answer was always simple: no, not in the rivers. Their wealth wasn't measured in dust or coins, but in the permanence of land, in the trust of neighbors, and in the steady heartbeat of a family that had endured when so many had not. Around the hearth in the evenings, James and Margaret reflected on the choices that had defined their lives. They remembered the frozen trail out of Missouri, the nights of hunger, the fever that nearly stole their children, and the theft that almost broke them. Yet through it all, they had chosen to build instead of chase. That choice had become their greatest inheritance. The orchards bore fruit, the store thrived, and the community flourished. The Dawsons were no longer wanderers chasing a fleeting promise. They were builders of permanence. Their story echoed across town as a quiet reminder of what endurance could achieve. As the sun set over California's hills, James stood with Margaret at his side, their children nearby, laughter rising from the orchard. The gold rush had begun with a desperate gamble, but it ended with something far greater, a family legacy rooted deep in the soil of the West. And in that golden light, James understood the truth at last. The greatest fortune they had ever found was not gold at all. It was legacy, carried forward in the roots they had planted, and in the generations who would one day walk the land they had built with sacrifice and vision. The Dawsons' story was never truly about gold. It was about the choices made when the glitter faded and reality demanded something deeper. They arrived in California like thousands of others, chasing a dream of sudden fortune. But where most found disappointment, the Dawsons discovered vision, the ability to see opportunity not in the rivers, but in the needs of people. That vision turned hardship into stability, and stability into a legacy. Their journey reminds us that true wealth rarely comes from chance. It is built in the quiet decisions, the resilience to endure trials, and the courage to plant roots where others see only uncertainty. The Dawsons could have chased the mines until their bodies broke, but instead they built a store, cultivated orchards, and left their children not just land, but the wisdom to grow it. In doing so, they proved that fortune is fleeting, but legacy endures. As we look back on their saga, we find lessons still relevant today. Wealth is not measured in sudden gains, but in the strength of what we build for the generations that follow. For James and Margaret Dawson, the greatest treasure was not pulled from the earth. It was rooted in family, community, and the enduring promise of tomorrow.